Behind Hollywood's brightest smiles were children whose illnesses, disabilities, and suffering shattered the private lives of the stars who loved them. Jean Tierney discovered that her daughter's lifelong condition may have begun because an infected fan broke quarantine just to meet her. William Christopher was told by a doctor to return his adopted autistic son as though the child were a defective purchase. And Dorothy Dandridge, bankrupt and losing her home, was finally forced to place her disabled daughter in a state institution after resisting it for almost 20 years. William Christopher and Barbara Christopher. Ned Christopher. Ned Christopher was only a small child when his father, William Christopher, was beginning the role that would make him famous on MASH TV show. Even in toddlerhood, Ned showed signs that something was different. He wanted to dress himself, and if his underwear did not feel right, he could erupt in rage. He hated being held and went stiff when people tried to cuddle him. He developed intense fixations and could recite names that startled adults around him. But despite all that, he still could not say his own name. As the years passed, he fell further behind other children. The family went from one specialist to another and got wildly different conclusions. One said he was hopeless. Another said he was only a little slow and would catch up. It took years before doctors finally identified autism. One specialist gave advice that William Christopher never forgot. Since the boy was adopted, the doctor said, why not give him back? Christopher later repeated the exact comparison. You reached into a barrel and pulled out a bad apple. Why not put the apple back? William and Barbara Christopher refused. Instead, they raised Ned and eventually wrote Mixed Blessings, a book about life with their son and the choices they had made. Sylvester Stallone and Sasha Chuck. Sir Joe Stallone. Sir Joe Stallone was born in 1979, the second son of Sylvester Stallone and Sasha Chuck. As a baby, he appeared briefly in Rocky II, playing Rocky Balboa's infant son. At home, his parents began noticing signs that did not fit ordinary development. Sarjo was quiet, withdrawn, and hard to reach through normal communication. At 3, he was diagnosed with autism. The diagnosis changed the family's daily life. Sirio did not become a public Hollywood child. He was kept mostly out of the spotlight, while Sasha carried much of the work at home. Stallone later said Sasha did the hard in the trenches care while he used film premieres to raise money. In 1985, Stallone and CH established a research fund administered through the National Society for Children and Adults with Autism. Jean Tierney and Oleg Cassini, Annuanet Daria Cassini. In 1943, Tierney was pregnant with her first daughter when she made a brief appearance at the Hollywood canteen. Not long afterward, she came down with German measles, rubella. Their daughter, Antoinette Daria Cassini, was born on October 15, 1943. The consequences were devastating. Daria was born with congenital rubella syndrome, a condition linked to deafness, cataracts, and profound developmental impairment. About a year after the birth, a former Marine approached her and reminded her that they had met at the Hollywood canteen. Then the woman asked a chilling question. Had Tierney happened to get German measles after that meeting? She had broken quarantine to come. Tierney never forgot it. Daria lived much of her life in institutional care. Even after Jean Tierney and Oleg Cassini separated, her care remained a permanent responsibility written into the legal and financial arrangements that followed the marriage. She lived into old age, dying on September 11, 2010, just short of her 67th birthday. Arthur Miller and Ingamarath, Daniel Miller. Daniel Miller was born in November 1966, the second child of Arthur Miller and Ingamarath. The diagnosis came at birth, Down syndrome. Within days, Daniel was placed in a home for infants in New York City. When he was about 4, he was moved to Southbury Training School in Connecticut, a large state institution only about 10 minutes from the Miller home in Roxbury. Ingamarath visited him often, reportedly almost every Sunday. Miller rarely spoke about Daniel and did not mention him in his 1987 memoir, Time Bends. Southbury was overcrowded by the early 1970s. Former staff remembered Daniel as friendly and able, but also remembered children living in large rooms, wearing communal clothing, and growing up with little personal property.
Daniel left Southbury at 17, moved into a group home, and later lived with support in a more independent setting.
Before Miller died in 2005, Daniel was included equally in his will. Patricia Neal and Roald Dahl, Theo Dahl. On December 5, 1960, 4-month-old Theod was out in his pram in New York with the family nanny when a taxi struck the carriage. The baby suffered severe head trauma, including multiple skull fractures and brain injury. For about 2 weeks, he was kept in an oxygen tent while doctors fought to save him. He survived the first crisis.
Then came the second. The injury led to hydrocephalus, a dangerous buildup of pressure and fluid on the brain. Surgeons implanted a shunt to drain it, but the device repeatedly failed. Over the following months, Theo underwent revision after revision as blockages returned and the pressure kept swinging. At times, those pressure changes even caused temporary blindness. When the family returned to Britain in early 1961, Theo's treatment continued under pediatric neurosurgeon Kenneth Till at Great Ormond Street Hospital. Roald Dahl, desperate to help, brought in Stanley Wade, an engineer and toymaker known for his precision work. Together, Wade, Dahl, and Till studied where the existing system was failing. Out of that crisis came the Wade, Dahl Till valve, introduced in 1962 and later used in thousands of children. The bitter irony was that Theo himself never needed the new device. By then, his condition had stabilized, but the accident that almost killed him ended up helping other families for years afterward. Red Skelton and Georgia Davis. Richard Skelton. Red Skelton and Georgia Davis had 2 children. Their son Richard was born in 1948.
The diagnosis came when Richard was 9 years old.
Doctors found leukemia and told the family he might have only a year to live. The illness changed the household immediately. Skelton's television network told him he could take as much time off as he needed, but he returned to work in January 1957 because he believed staying active would help him keep Richard's last year as normal as possible. After the diagnosis, the family took Richard on an extended trip so he could see as much of the world as possible. On July 22, 1957, they had an audience with Pope Pius XII. Richard later said that meeting was the high point of the trip. The family returned to the United States as his illness advanced. Richard Skelton died in Los Angeles on May 10, 1958, 10 days before his 10th birthday. Bob Denver and Dree Denver. Colin Denver. Colin Denver was born in 1984, the son of Bob Denver and his 4th wife, Dree Denver.
2 years later, Colin was diagnosed with severe autism. His condition also included a seizure disorder.
The diagnosis changed the household immediately. Bob and Dree moved back to West Virginia near Drama's family and their daily life became centered on Colin's care. Drema later said people wrote to the family website asking where Bob had gone.
They did not know he had stepped away from the old career rhythm to care for a severely autistic child at home.
The Denvers spent the next 2 decades caring for Colin full-time. Drema said they did it without outside help and gave up everything for him.
In 2004, Bob and Dree formed a non-profit foundation to help children with special needs and their families. Little Buddy Radio was created as part of that work.
Louis Armstrong and Daisy Parker. Clarence Armstrong. During a heavy rain in New Orleans, little Clarence, a child Armstrong was raising, wandered onto the wet rear gallery of their second-floor apartment. The wood was old and slick.
Armstrong later said he and Daisy were in the front room listening to records when they suddenly heard crying. He ran to the back and saw the child climbing up the steps, hurt and terrified, holding his head.
Armstrong brought in the best doctors he could afford.
They told him the fall had caused permanent damage. Clarence, he was told, would remain years behind other children mentally.
Armstrong tried school after school.
One Catholic school kept him for a while, then sent him home. At that point, Armstrong stopped chasing miracle answers and focused on the child in front of him.
He created routines.
He tried to teach basic reading, writing, and spelling. Whenever work took him away, he made sure someone was there to look after Clarence.
When Armstrong moved north to Chicago, Clarence went too.
There he attended a special school and according to Armstrong became known as one of the best athletes in the group, baseball, basketball, football, and around the neighborhood as Little Louis Armstrong. But stability remained fragile.
Armstrong later described Clarence as nervous and easily frightened, especially in tense households where adults yelled around him.
Eventually, he moved Clarence into another home where the boy felt safer.
And Armstrong did not hide him.
In 1949, he even brought Clarence onto live television, letting him say a few words on the Eddie Condon Floor Show.
Neil Young and Peggy Young. Ben Young.
Ben Young was born in 1978, the first child of Neil Young and Peggy Young.
The diagnosis came in infancy.
Neil later wrote that when Ben was about 6 months old, a doctor told the parents their son had cerebral palsy.
Ben's condition was severe. He had major physical disabilities and could not speak in the ordinary way. The next problem was school.
Ben needed teachers who could work with children who had severe speech and physical impairments. Neil and Peggy could not find the right place for him. In 1986, they helped create the Bridge School in Hillsborough, California. The school was built for children like Ben, children who needed help communicating, learning, and taking part in ordinary life despite severe disabilities. Ben later graduated from Half Moon Bay High School in 1998. 1 year later, he started a chicken farm on the family ranch.
Spencer Tracy and Louise Tracy. John Tracy. John 10. Brooke Tracy was born on June 26, 1924 in Milwaukee.
Before he was a year old, his mother, Louise, began to notice something was wrong.
Loud noises did not startle him. She called his name again and again. He never turned.
Doctors diagnosed him with deafness, what they called at the time nerve deafness. There was no treatment to offer and Louise was essentially told to wait until the boy was old enough for formal schooling. She refused to wait. Instead, she began working with him at home every day, speaking directly in front of his face, repeating sounds and words, teaching him to watch lips and follow expressions. In 1927, when John was just 3, she enrolled him in the Wright Oral School in New York, where deaf children were taught to speak in Libra. Then another crisis came.
John contracted polio, adding physical disability to everything the family was already facing. But Louise kept going.
Years later, in July 1942, she spoke publicly about what it meant to raise a deaf child. That talk helped launch a parent training program in Los Angeles that eventually became the John Tracy Clinic, an institution built so other families would not have to face the same fear and confusion alone. Richard Burton and Sybil Williams, Jessica Burton. Richard Burton and Sybil Williams had 2 daughters. Kate was born in 1957 and Jessica was born 2 years later while the family was living in Salini, Switzerland near Lake Geneva. Jessica's life moved almost immediately outside the public Burton story. Her condition was described as severe autism with psychiatric illness. Kate Burton said Jessica was placed in institutional care when she was 6 years old. The separation became permanent. Kate later said Jessica had been in a home for a very long time and that her care had become part of the family's life. In a 2003 interview, Kate described her younger sister as severely autistic and said she was living in an institution in the United States. There were few public details about Jessica's daily life. No career, no interviews, no public appearances, no adult biography. The one clear family detail was financial. Kate said Richard Burton had earned enough money to make sure Jessica could receive care for the rest of her life. David Tomlinson and Audrey Freeman, Willie Tomlinson. David Tomlinson and Audrey Freeman's third son, Willie, grew up in a Britain where autism was still barely understood. As a child, Willie showed the features of autism at a time when even getting a clear diagnosis was difficult. Families were often left with almost no guidance, few specialist schools, few trained teachers, and very little public language for children who did not speak, learn, or react like others. Tomlinson and Audrey became part of the early parent fight for autistic children and adults. They joined roughly 20 families who helped create Somerset Court, the first residential home in Europe devoted specifically to autistic adults. Tomlinson also used theater and television contacts to raise money for the fledgling autistic movement, including Robert Moley, Ian Carmichael, Felicity Kendall, and even the Beatles. Willie later lived at Somerset Court, then moved to a nearby offshoot. He had his own workshop there and became known as a skilled craftsman in wood. Leonard Golden and Isabel Golden.
Janice Cookie Golden. Janice Golden Cookie by her family was born in 1943 with cerebral palsy. Her younger sister later said Cookie's condition was severe and that the entire household revolved around it. Leonard and Isabel Golden quickly discovered what countless parents of disabled children were learning in those years. There were few specialists, little guidance, and almost no system built to help families. So, they began building one.
In 1948, the Goldens joined with Jack and Ethel Hausman, another couple raising a child with cerebral palsy. Together they placed an advertisement in the New York Herald Tribune asking other parents to write in if they were facing the same struggle. The answer was overwhelming. Hundreds of families responded. By August 12, 1949, a national cerebral palsy organization had been chartered, bringing scattered local efforts under one umbrella. Soon television was being used to raise money and public awareness. In 1950, United Cerebral Palsy launched an early telethon, pushing the issue into millions of American homes. Cookie herself never outgrew the diagnosis. She died in 1973, still young. Julie Newmer and J.A. Holtzsmith, John Jules Smith. Julie Newmer's son, John Jules Smith, was born in 1981 when she was 48. He was born with Down syndrome. For Newmer, the birth came after 3 miscarriages and John became her only child.
His medical problems deepened when he was still a toddler. He contracted meningitis, survived the infection but lost his hearing.
After that, communication became part of the daily care. John was deaf and non-speaking and Newmer learned sign language so she could reach him. She later said visual things delighted him because sight became one of the main ways he connected with the world. The household adjusted around his needs. John lived with Newmer, made art, attended art classes, and spent time with her in the garden. In later years, his scoliosis also limited how much he could walk. Newmer had 2 longtime assistants who helped with meals, household tasks, John's care, and his art classes. Charlotte Ray and John Strauss. Andrew Andy Strauss. When Andy Strauss was still very young, Charlotte Ray felt that something was wrong, but she could not name it. While pregnant with her younger son, she took Andy for evaluation. The doctor examined him and told her to come back after the baby was born. When she returned, the verdict was blunt. Her son, the doctor said, was autistic. Ree later recalled that she misheard the word and answered, "He's artistic." The doctor corrected her, "No, autistic." Then came the next blow. "Wait another year," he said. And if Andy had not improved by 6, institutionalize him. Charlotte Ray refused. She and her husband looked for schools, programs, anything that might help. A minister found a school for Andy near 12th Street and 5th Avenue. The tuition was $2,000 a year, a major burden at the time. Even getting him there became its own crisis. Ree eventually stopped working so she could focus on Andy and his brother, then began organizing and protesting for transportation so disabled children could get to school. Later in life, she described Andy's condition in severe terms and spoke openly about how hard those years became. At 16, she said he ended up in the juvenile ward at Bellevue because he was considered unstable and dangerous. Jacqueline Suzanne and Irving Mansfield. Guy Mansfield. Guy Hildy Mansfield was born on December 6, 1946. The only child of Jacqueline Suzanne and Irving Mansfield. The first signs appeared in early childhood. Guy screamed, hit his head against the wall, and lost the few words he had learned. At 3, Dr. Loretta Bender, a specialist in children's psychiatric disorders, diagnosed him with autism, a condition still only beginning to be identified. Bender treated him with shock therapy. When it failed, she advised the Mansfields to place Guy at the Emma Pendleton Bradley Home, a psychiatric institution for children in Rhode Island. The family kept the truth outside the newspapers. Friends were told that Guy was away at school in Arizona because of severe asthma. The reason, according to people close to the family, was that his parents still hoped he might recover and did not want him stigmatized. In 2000, Guy was still living in institutional care and still receiving regular visits. Edner and Carol Jean Vogelman, Charlie Asner. Ed Asner's youngest son, Charlie, was diagnosed with high-functioning autism when he was about 8 or 9 years old. Before the diagnosis, the family did not have a clear name for what was happening. Charlie had poor social skills, struggled to fit in with classmates, and behaved in ways adults could mistake for defiance or lack of empathy. Asner later said he had seen his son as high-spirited and a rule-breaker before doctors identified autism.
The diagnosis changed the family's direction.
Charlie's autism became part of Asner's public advocacy, and Asner spoke about how communication with his son required patience, repetition, and careful explanation. He said he had to slow down, make each word count, and make sure each thought was understood.
The autism work continued into the next generation.
Matthew Asner, Ed's older son, later had children on the autism spectrum and helped build the Ed Asner Family Center for neurodivergent people and their families.
Anna Magnani, Luca Magnani. Luca Magnani was born in Rome in October 1942.
His mother was already becoming one of Italy's great screen stars, but she raised him as a single parent and guarded her private life fiercely.
Then polio entered the story.
In 1944, when Luca was still a toddler, he caught the disease. The paralysis remained.
Years passed and the improvement never came.
By the time he was 7, he still could not use his legs and spent much of his time in a sanitarium for treatment. Those who saw him remembered a handsome, dark-haired boy who seemed healthy in every visible way, except for the paralysis that had taken his legs from him.
Magnani poured money into treatment.
Doctors, clinics, specialists, promises. At last, she was told the truth. The damage was permanent.
Luca would not walk again.
The actress pushed for better contracts and higher fees in an effort to secure her son's financial future. At one point, she saw a legless war veteran dragging himself along a sidewalk, and the sight stayed with her. Afterward, she said something bleak and unforgettable. She realized it would be worse when children like Luca grew up. Mia Farrow's family, Moses, Tam, and Thaddeus.
Mia Farrow's home included several adopted children whose medical problems began before they entered the family.
Moses Farrow was adopted from Korea when he was 2 years old. He had cerebral palsy, a condition that affects movement and muscle control. He later became a family therapist and photographer, but his childhood began with a physical disability that required care, adaptation, and a household built around different needs.
Tam Farrow came from Vietnam and was blind.
In New York, she needed special education, and Farrow tried to build a school plan around her disability.
Tam died in 2000 with heart problems given as the cause. Thaddeus Farrow was adopted from Kolkata, India in 1994.
He was paraplegic and used a wheelchair.
He had spent his early life in an orphanage before coming to the United States.
Tex Ritter and Dorothy Faye Tom Ritter.
Tom Ritter was born with cerebral palsy.
Years later, his mother Dorothy Faye Ritter described the birth as catastrophic. She said she had suffered a serious traffic accident, that her back was broken, and that Tom had to be delivered by cesarean section. She described the moment in extreme terms, saying that both she and the baby had effectively been gone for 11 minutes. Whatever exactly happened in that delivery room, the consequences stayed for life. As the boys grew up, Tom's disability became part of daily family life. His brother, John Ritter, later remembered that he often thought Tom was stronger than their parents believed. When Tom fell down, John would tell him to get up. He also taught him to play wiffle ball. Dorothy Faye later spoke of Tom not as a tragedy, but as proof that cerebral palsy did not erase a future. He grew into adulthood, studied at several universities, and in the early 1970s even spent a summer in Washington working for the Senate Select Committee investigating Watergate. Olivia de Havilland and Marcus Goodrich, Benjamin Goodrich. Benjamin Briggs Goodrich was born on September 27, 1949, the only child of Olivia de Havilland and writer Marcus Goodrich. His illness began when he was 19. Doctors diagnosed him with Hodgkin's lymphoma, a cancer of the lymphatic system.
Benjamin survived the first fight and continued building a life outside Hollywood.
He graduated from the University of Texas, worked as a statistical analyst for Lockheed Missiles and Space Company in Sunnyvale, California, and later became an international banking representative for Texas Commerce Bank in Houston.
But the cancer story did not end with survival.
Reports on Benjamin's death describe a long illness and connect his final condition to the after-effects of Hodgkin's treatment. For patients treated for Hodgkin's lymphoma, late complications can include heart disease years after treatment.
Benjamin died in Paris on September 29, 1991, 2 days after his 42nd birthday. Burt Bacharach and Angie Dickinson. Leah Nikki Bacharach. Leah Nikki Bacharach was born on July 12, 1966. The only child of Burt Bacharach and Angie Dickinson. She arrived 3 months premature and weighed less than 29. Nikki spent her first months in hospital care, separated from ordinary touch while doctors tried to keep her alive. The effects of that birth followed her into childhood. Her eyesight was damaged. She developed strabismus and later her poor vision kept her from pursuing geology, the subject she studied at California Lutheran University. She also did not speak until she was 3. The harder problems were behavioral and sensory. Nikki was socially withdrawn, obsessive, and dependent on repetition. She had bouts of frustration and rage, and sound could become unbearable to her. No one gave the family the right name in childhood. Bacharach later said doctors did not call it Asperger's or autism. They called it behavior things. At 14, Nikki was hospitalized for psychiatric treatment. She was diagnosed with Asperger's only years after it entered the American Psychiatric Manual in 1994. Angie Dickinson later said hospitalization was the worst thing that could have been done to her daughter. Nikki died on January 4, 2007 at the age of 40. Roy Rogers and Dale Evans. Robin Elizabeth Rogers. Robin Elizabeth Rogers was born on August 26, 1950. Dale Evans later recalled that the nurses noticed immediately that the baby was blue. The umbilical cord had been wrapped around her neck and Robin was placed in an oxygen box while doctors and nurses gathered around her whispering and running tests. 3 weeks later, another blow came. A doctor found a heart murmur and told Dale that it was another complication often linked to Down syndrome. Then came the advice Evans never forgot. In cases like this, he said babies should be placed in an institution as early as possible before the child became too deeply rooted in the parents' hearts. Roy Rogers and Dale Evans refused. They brought Robin home to the Hollywood Hills where her brothers and sisters crowded around to see her. But caring for her was not simple. Dale described Robin turning blue during feedings because she struggled to suck hard enough from a bottle. As Robin grew, her care became more structured. Dale wrote about a devoted caregiver called Cow Cow. When the family later moved near NNO, they built a small, separate house so Robin and her nurse could live there comfortably, but still at home, still with the family because Dale did not want her daughter hidden away. Robin was taken outside in a small cart to see the animals, and Dale remembered a dog named Lana staying close to her. Then in 1952, disaster struck. The other children came down with mumps, and Robin caught it, too. What began with swelling quickly turned into something far worse. Dale wrote that the fever climbed with terrifying speed. 2 doctors worked over the child as Roy and Dale paced outside, waiting for news. One doctor warned them Robin could die in seconds. She did. Dale Evans later wrote that Robin died shortly after 8 p.m. on August 24, 1952, just 2 days before her second birthday. The next year, Evans published Angel Unaware, turning Robin's brief life into one of the most famous memoirs ever written by an old Hollywood mother about a disabled child. Carol O'Connor and Nancy O'Connor. Hugh O'Connor. Carol O'Connor and Nancy O'Connor adopted Hugh in Rome in 1962 when he was 6 days old. The medical crisis came when Hugh was 16. He was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease, a cancer of the lymphatic system. Treatment included surgery to remove a malignant lump in his neck, and his parents later said the radiation left him sick enough that he began using marijuana to eat. That was the first step into a much longer addiction. Hugh later moved from marijuana to alcohol, cods, cocaine, amphetamines, and prescription drugs. He went through rehabilitation more than once, but the illness that began with the cancer treatment kept turning into another kind of medical fight. On March 28, 1995, Hugh called his father and said he could not face another He died that day at 32. Harry Thomas Persigian was later convicted of possessing and furnishing cocaine to Hugh.
In 1997, California passed the Drug Dealer Liability Act backed publicly by Carol Ochenor, Robert Redford, and Lola Van Wagen, Scott and James Redford.
Robert Redford and Lola Van Wagen's first son, Scott Anthony Redford, was born in 19